Right, hello everyone. Today we're going to be looking at a primary source question, and first of all we're going to be looking at what you're going to be expected to do and where you will find this sort of question in the paper. So section A of the paper, there will be a compulsory question. So unlike the essay, you won't have a choice. They'll give you a primary source and that's it, ultimately. Now, what you'll be expected to do is to analyse and evaluate that source. So you'll be needing to examine and scrutinise the source and then assess what makes it valuable, what reduces its value to a historian, and then weigh it up, ultimately. So, you'll also be given three sources. Today we're just going to be looking at one. And in your assessment, you're expected to talk about the provenance of the source, so who the author is, who the intended audience is, to talk about the tone of the source, how it comes across to the reader, what the source is emphasizing, what it chooses to emphasize, that is, and also its content, what it's arguing. Now, in everything that you do, you must show off your subject knowledge. If you don't do that, then as you can see at the bottom here, generalized comment, not talking about the value of the source or referring to the question, it will mean that you won't get any credit for that. So everything you talk about must be about, is the source valuable, what reduces its value, using that subject knowledge to help you do that. But everything must be focused on the question. So here is a question that we're going to be looking at. So you always have the same stem, the beginning of the question. So always begin with this, with reference to the source and your understanding of the historical context. So you'll always have that. It's the bit after this comma that changes. So assess the value of these sources to historians studying the reasons why President Johnson continued American involvement in Vietnam. So if we quickly break down this question together, as we have done before. So first of all, we want to focus on the command word in this question, and that is assess. Now, to assess something means you weigh up its strengths and its weaknesses. You will be looking at arguments in favour and against. What makes it valuable, what reduces its value. Okay, and then you'll make an informed judgment at the end. So for example, if you're going to assess this video, you might say, well, it points me in the right direction, it tells me what I should be talking about, but it might be a little bit overlong. We'll wait and find out. So the second thing, when we break down this question, is we're looking at the focus of this question, and that is this bit in bold here. The reasons why President Johnson continued American involvement in Vietnam after the assassination of JFK. So everything we talk about, we need to be thinking about, well, does this source help us to understand why President Johnson decided, surprisingly, to continue American involvement in Vietnam? And the limitation to this question is President Johnson. So we don't want to be talking about President Kennedy, who we have been looking at. We don't want to be talking about Richard Nixon, who will come next. Spoiler alert. It'll be surprising if we did talk about Richard Nixon because we haven't studied him yet. But everything we want to be talking about is looking at President Johnson's motivations. So here we've got the generic mark scheme. We're just going to be worried about the bit at the top here, the level 5. So it's out of 30, and you can see it says that you need to show a very good understanding of the source. We're only looking at one today. Okay, so do you understand what it's arguing, what it's getting at, who the author is, who the intended audience might be? And you need to combine that with a strong awareness of the historical context. So everything that you're talking about needs to be linked to your understanding of what's been going on in the background. You need to present a balanced argument. So you must look at what makes it valuable and what reduces its value. So at this early stage, I'm going to emphasize that every source is valuable. However, some are more valuable than others. So in no answer will you be able to say, and should you say, that this source is not valuable. Okay, that will really annoy the examiner. In this case, me. So you need to make sure that you make a substantiated judgment. You need to make sure that your third paragraph, which probably will be the shortest of the three, comes to some sort of explained conclusion. So now we know what we need to do. Let's have a little look at what makes a source valuable. So you probably want to be using this sort of phrase on a regular basis. Source whatever is useful to a historian or less useful to a historian because it helps us to understand whatever. So let's have a look at what a source might do to be valuable. First of all, it might show us information about an event. What happened, what the causes were, what the consequences were. It might be valuable because it might show us the attitudes or beliefs of the author. This one certainly does. It might help us to understand the motivations behind an action or policy. This source will do that too. It might help us to understand the reasons for an event happening or a point of view changing. This one's more about the consequences. This one might help us to understand what made a plan successful or a failure. This one won't be talking about that much because it's more about the causes of a policy, really. It might help us to understand the effects of something. Again, this is thinking more about the consequences of an event. It might help us to understand the opinions of key people. In this case, this one does because it helps us to understand the opinions of Lyndon Baines Johnson. It might help us to understand the priorities of a government. We'll see that here as well as Johnson tries to understand or explain his priorities for Vietnam. And lastly, it might help us to understand, or it might be valuable because it explains the author's concerns about something. And again, that comes through here. So I'm going to play the clip that shows Lyndon Baines Johnson making this speech, and this is from the American online channel C-SPAN, and then we'll look at the source together as it is written. But this is Lyndon Baines Johnson taking us through the source, so you get a bit of an idea of the tone.
We are there because we have a promise to keep. Since 1954, every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam. We have helped to build, and we have helped to defend. Thus, over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise. To dishonor that pledge, to abandon this small and brave nation to its enemies, and to the terror that must follow, would be an unforgivable wrong. We're also there to strengthen world order. Around the globe, from Berlin to Thailand, are people whose well-being rests in part on the belief that they can count on us if they are attacked. To leave Vietnam to its fate would shake the confidence of all these people in the value of an American commitment and in the value of America's word. The result would be increased unrest and instability and even wider war. We're also there because there are great stakes in the balance. Let no one think for a moment that retreat from Vietnam would bring an end to conflict. The battle would be renewed in one country and then another. The central lesson of our time is that the appetite of aggression is never satisfied. To withdraw from one battlefield means only to prepare for the next. We must say in Southeast Asia, as we did in Europe, in the words of the Bible, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. We are there.
Right, so this speech is known as the Peace Without Conquest speech, and although it was made to the audience that you can see there in that video, it was also shared to millions of people around America and around the world as well. So it's a very famous speech. Now, here is the speech that we just saw there as written. Now what you might want to do is pause the video at this stage, have a little look at the source, and have a little look at, first of all, what is the provenance of this source? So who is the author? And does that make it valuable or less valuable? When was it written? What was going on? Who was the audience or the intended audience? Does that make it valuable or less valuable? And you might also want to think about the tone or the emphasis of this source. So how is it coming across? What is Johnson emphasizing here, and does that make it valuable or not? Okay, so you'll have a worksheet that I will send to you, and you might want to note down some thoughts at this early stage about what you think about this source. Okay, remembering to emphasize what makes it valuable and less valuable in relation to the question. So you might want to pause this video here before we move on. So, to help you to understand then this source a bit more, we're just going to go through the 4 reasons why Johnson continued US involvement in Vietnam briefly. So the first one is the personal beliefs of Lyndon Baines Johnson. So he, like many Americans, believed that the US were superior to the Vietnamese, militarily at least. He, as JFK's vice president, had opposed any appeasement of North Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. He believed in the domino theory, so if he felt that if America failed Vietnam, then wider conflict could result. And he also felt that the US had a duty to defend freedom, much like Kennedy had, and ultimately this would be continuing their policy of defending freedom as they had done in the Korean War and the 2 world wars that had preceded it. Secondly, there was a legacy of President Kennedy. As I mentioned before, Lyndon Baines Johnson had been Kennedy's vice president. As his vice president, they didn't always agree, and he had opposed the coup by the military and the resulting assassination of Diem in South Vietnam. You might remember that Diem was a leader of Vietnam who was propped up by the Americans financially. And eventually Kennedy had decided to back a military coup to try and get rid of Diem because he was failing in his attempts to resist Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. So he had opposed that move, believing that they would only lead to wider American involvement in South Vietnam and Vietnam as a whole. Overall, Johnson did not want a massive ground war in Asia. There'd already been one in Korea, and he didn't want a second. He feared, however, the consequences of withdrawing from Vietnam. So while he didn't want a ground war in Asia, equally he didn't want to leave Vietnam completely either. He was worried about what that might mean about his election chances. He had to win over 2 sides. He had to win over mainly Republicans who were skeptical about Johnson, skeptical about Kennedy and how serious they were about tackling communism. So he was worried about a second wave of McCarthyism in America, accusing him of being weak, or maybe even accusing him of not taking communism seriously. But equally, he had to preserve JFK's flexible response legacy of wanting to tackle communism, but trying to resist a ground war where possible. So he had 2 sides to try and win over, mainly Republicans on the right and mainly Democrats who were seen as more dovish, more about diplomacy. The third motivation were Johnson's advisors, who were mainly those advisors that Kennedy had. He had kept many of these advisors on in his cabinet. People like Robert McNamara, who was his Secretary of Defense, and Dean Rusk, who was his Secretary of State. Many of these advisors that he had kept on were hawks. Yes, they were Democrats, but they were hawks. They were very much in favour of actively getting more involved and escalating the conflict in Vietnam. Many influential military leaders like Curtis LeMay had also pressurised Johnson to bomb Vietnam as well. So it very much seemed like he had a range of advisors telling him the same thing. However, it is worth noting that Johnson chose these people. He chose to keep these people on. And he always expected, like all presidents do, that he would have complete obedience from his advisors. So he wanted people around him who agreed with him, an echo chamber of people who would agree with him and his policy. An example of that would be his Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who urged the President Johnson, to withdraw from Vietnam. And when he did that, he shut him out of decision making. That's something that presidents can do. And so perhaps that shows that really he was in agreement with McNamara, Rusk and military leaders like LeMay. Lastly is the maintenance of US honour. Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't want to be the first president to lose a war. He was well aware that many people around him and around America considered him a pretender to the throne until at least he won the election in 1964. That he was only president because Kennedy had been assassinated. So he really lacked legitimacy because he didn't actually win an election until 1964. So he had to be aware that he was under a lot of pressure, and he actually created his own personal pressure as well. He was heavily involved in day-to-day running of America, like all presidents probably should be, but he was very insecure. He was a bit of an egomaniac. He was desperate to be as loved as Kennedy was before him. So all of those four factors come together to push Johnson to want to continue involvement in Vietnam. So let's now consider why Johnson made this speech, this Peace Without Conquest speech. So this was a televised address that you just saw from Johns Hopkins University. And it was estimated that around about 60 million people around the US were tuning in to watch this, to listen to their president talk about Vietnam and the tackling of communism. This speech was seen as a response to months of heavy criticism that Johnson had received from people in the US and around the world for getting more and more involved in Vietnam. Now, Johnson had won the 1964 presidential election, and he won it, in fairness, in a resounding way. One of the largest, if not the largest, presidential wins in American history. But he had won it as the peace candidate, and he had subsequently ordered the bombing of North Vietnam and dispatched hundreds of thousands of US ground troops to the area. So it seemed like he was going against his promises. So he needed to explain why. So the main purpose of this speech was to get rid of this criticism and to bring people on his side, because he wanted to really focus on civil rights and the Great Society idea. He wanted to focus on domestic things. He wanted to focus on giving African Americans the right to vote and other rights as well. He wanted to focus on making the average American's lives better too. He very much saw what was going on in Vietnam as something that was distracting him from that. Now, he was so worried about how this speech would be received that he actually gave drafts of this speech to the very famous journalist Walter Lippmann and other members of Congress to make sure that it went down well with them before he then made it to America and the world. And they very much endorsed this speech. Now, Walter Lippmann was a very high-profile journalist who actually opposed greater involvement in Vietnam. Now, like Walter Lippmann, the New York Times and the Washington Post were alarmed at the escalation of America's involvement in Vietnam, and they were writing that there should be a negotiated exit in 1965, the year after Johnson had been elected. And these were two very influential newspapers, the two most read newspapers at the time. It's also worth noting that many average Americans, normal Americans, were writing to the White House and to the Senate and to the House, all parts of Congress, writing to their senators, representatives, president, not all, but mainly indicating that they were in opposition to the escalated involvement in Vietnam. So, as I've mentioned, this speech was to win over public support, to bring on side the militant hawks, and he would do that by promising to defend South Vietnam and its independence. But he would also try and win over the non-military dovish people by promising to try and negotiate with South Vietnam and North Vietnam to bring about peace, and also offer $1 billion in aid to try and win over the Vietnamese people as a sort of carrot to win them over. This would be to, for example, develop the Mekong River basin to bring about hydroelectric power and to win support for the South Vietnamese government. So while there was domestic pressure, there was also Allied pressure too. His NATO allies and members of the UN were complaining that they disagreed with this move. The UN Security General at the time called this escalation unnecessary. The President of France at the time, one of America's closest allies, Charles de Gaulle, wanted America to withdraw from Vietnam completely, and he wanted to make sure that the 1954 Geneva Agreement was kept to. This was the agreement where America and France agreed that France would leave Vietnam, that there would be free democratic elections as well. And their other close ally, Britain, thought that this escalation in Vietnam was hopeless, that it wouldn't bring about victory, that it was misguided. So this speech was to win over public support in America, but also in countries like France and Britain, its NATO allies as well. So when we talk about the provenance, this will likely be in your first paragraph. So here you want to talk about who the author of the source is. Who is Lyndon Baines Johnson? What does that make him valuable or less valuable? When was the source made? What else was happening in the country or the world at the time? What is in Lyndon Baines Johnson's mind at the time? What pressures are there on him? Does that make this source valuable or less valuable? Okay. Don't talk about it was written at the time, therefore it's closer to the event, therefore it makes it more valuable. That is not useful to us. That also doesn't make sense, because sources written many, many years later can be valuable too, with the benefit of hindsight. So don't talk about the time as much. Think about what you can learn from the person who made it. Since the author is the president, what can we learn from him? What makes him valuable? What perhaps makes it less valuable too, from what we can learn from it? Think about who the intended audience might be. We've talked about this already. We know the audience was people in the audience, the immediate audience, yes, in Johns Hopkins University, but also it was going to be beamed around America and the world. So think about what might make that valuable or less valuable too. And also think about what was its purpose? Why was it made? Does that make it valuable or does it reduce its value? What we also perhaps want to talk about in our first paragraph is the tone and emphasis of the source. Now, by tone, we're talking about the author's attitude and emotions that we're able to detect from the text and from what we watched. So you might want to use this tone wheel here to help you use a variety of different words. So is it coming across that Johnson is disapproving of something, or repelled, or annoyed about something? Is he feeling guilty or vulnerable about something? Is he proud or optimistic about something? Is he confused or startled by something? Is he stressed or tired of something? Is he anxious or insecure about something? I certainly think it's coming across that he is optimistic about Vietnam's future, but it also perhaps is coming across that he is anxious or insecure. He's wanting to win over the American public and the public around the world in allied countries too. So when we're talking about the tone, we want to be thinking about how does the type of source, influence the tone? So the type of source is a speech. So how might that influence the tone? How did that come across when you were watching and listening to it? How does the purpose of the source, that is to win over the public, influence the tone? So does the tone come across as aggressive? Not really, because ultimately he wants to win over the American public. So he wants to come across as balanced, someone who is confident, someone who is assured, because he wants to win over the American public. How does the audience of the source influence the tone as well? So he knows he's talking to the immediate audience in front of him. He wants them to clap along, so that shows that he is popular and winning them over. But he knows that the audience is people around the world. So he needs to be able to make sure that his tone is something that can win them over. He doesn't want to come across as overly hawkish, militant, aggressive, because he knows that wouldn't do well. You might also want to bear in mind about, as the author is the president, that might influence his tone as well. He knows as president he needs to represent the whole of America. So he needs to represent all the differing views in America too. And lastly, how does the date of the source influence the tone? So we know by the date that a lot of things are going on at the time. He's just won an election, so he's going to be buoyant because of that. But also he knows that things are escalating quickly in Vietnam. So he's going to be rather insecure because of that. So here's an example about how we might talk about tone. So you might start off by saying the source is useful to a historian studying the reasons why Johnson continued US involvement in Vietnam because it helps us to understand the president's concerns. So the tone, Lyndon Baines Johnson is pleading with the public rather than browbeating them. He's not being aggressive. He argues that withdrawal would be an unforgivable wrong. It's always a good idea to quote from the source. Now, we then relate that back to value. This is useful because it was a long planned speech that underwent several drafts. As we mentioned, he gave it to congressmen and women. He gave it to Walter Lippmann as well. So it shows that he has thought about what he's going to talk about. It shows that this reveals something about his concerns. It's also useful because Johnson is attempting to appeal to both hawks and doves in America. It reveals the range of American opinion at the time. However, what limits his value is that this is a rather optimistic speech. He's coming across that he can solve the problems in Vietnam. He can bring America together. And as we know, in reality, the harsh reality is that both on the ground in Vietnam and in the US, he's going to find it very difficult to bring Americans together and bring both North and South America together as well. So this optimistic tone doesn't really fit in to the reality. Now in paragraph 2, content and argument, this is how you might talk about content and argument. So the source is useful to a historian studying the reasons why Johnson continued US involvement in Vietnam because, 1, it features a range of reasons why it is right to continue involvement in Vietnam. That's one part of the content. The second part is that it also identifies the ways in which the US were going to support Vietnam, South Vietnam anyway, as well. Now, Johnson makes 3 arguments in this extract of this source. 1, it tells the American public and the world that the US have a promise to keep to South Vietnam and the South Vietnamese people. Kennedy and Johnson, and Eisenhower too, since the 1954 Geneva Agreement, felt that they had a role in Vietnam. 2, he argues that withdrawal from Vietnam would not bring an end to the conflict, but actually would just increase the problems. Sort of thinking about that domino theory again, that actually if they left Vietnam, what would that mean about South Vietnam? Would it be able to stand up for itself? Probably not. Without that military help, without that economic help, but also thinking about, well, would it just increase unrest elsewhere? Would it just increase unrest in other places in Asia? But also in Europe as well. Thinking about Berlin, what message would this send to the Soviet Union if America gives up on Vietnam? Does that mean that they're going to give up on Berlin? What message is this sending to their allies? And lastly, he tells us that appeasing North Vietnam is not good enough. He argues that what history has shown, Johnson, is that the appetite of aggression is never satisfied. Appeasement doesn't work. He looks back to when America and Britain and France attempted to appease Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, and he argues that didn't work. So trying to appease Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam won't work either. He basically looks at Ho Chi Minh like he would have looked at Adolf Hitler. So we can't, he argues, we can't appease them. Sometimes you need to use the stick as well as the carrot. So an example of how we might talk about arguments and evaluate them, assess them, is you might start off by this opening argument. Way of starting your paragraph. The source is useful to historians studying the reasons why Johnson continued US involvement in Vietnam because it helps us to understand the president's beliefs. Lyndon Baines Johnson argues that the US have a promise to keep to South Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. Now this is useful because we know that in 1954 and a Geneva conference, the US felt it had a role in deciding the future of Vietnam. At that conference, America was part of that agreement, alongside France and North Vietnam too, and they agreed a range of things. They agreed that they would allow France to withdraw from Indochina, and they also agreed that they would temporarily divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel between North and South Vietnam, and that there would be elections within 2 years to decide a president and reunite the country. So you can see that there's been a recent history under a variety of presidents where they all believe that the US have a promise to keep to South Vietnam, the Vietnamese people, to protect their freedom, to protect them from communism. However, what reduces its value is that ultimately America hasn't always kept its promises to Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. This reduces the value of Johnson's argument. We know this because although America promised all those things at Geneva, because America was convinced that Ho Chi Minh and the communists would win in those elections, they never took place. What America did instead is establish an anti-communist government in South Vietnam instead. It provided them with military and economic help to keep it viable, to protect it from the expansion of North Vietnam and the communists. So how much we buy into Johnson's argument is debatable. There's useful parts, but there's also less valuable parts. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about the last paragraph, the judgment. We have assessed the tone, the emphasis, the content, the argument. Now we come to our last paragraph, the judgment. This is really, really important. This is the last bit that you're going to be leaving the examiner with, so it should be good. So you might want to use some of the following phrases when you are evaluating this source. On balance, the source is mostly valuable, or maybe not so valuable to a historian studying, in this case, the reasons why Johnson got involved in Vietnam, because, and then explain why you came to that position. You might use this sentence starter. To a certain extent, the source is valuable to historians studying why Johnson got involved in Vietnam because yada yada yada. However, it's less valuable because whatever. Lastly, you might want to use this sentence starter. Overall, the value of the source to historians studying the reasons why Johnson got involved in Vietnam outweighs the limitations, or the other way around. This is because. So you need to make a judgment and you need to explain it. You need to identify what made it valuable, but also what limited its value to. Your judgment must be balanced, like the rest of your answer has been. Now, hopefully you found this video useful. Do let me know if you have any questions, and I will be emailing you out a worksheet to help you with this too.